إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا وسيئات أعمالنا. من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له، وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له، وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله. أما بعد، تكلمنا في الأسبوع الماضي عن الحرية، وطرحنا أسئلة وأجبنا عن بعضها، وخلصنا إلى بعض النتائج التي منها أن الحرية هي منحة إلهية، وهي حق يولد مع الإنسان بولادته، وليست هي منة يمتن بها أحد على أحد. وهذا الحق، هذه الحرية هي التي تضمن للإنسان أن يمارس دوره في هذه الحياة الدنيا على الوجه الأفضل. وقررنا أيضا أن الإسلام جعل الحرية أساس العبادة، حرية اختيار العمل هو أساس العبادة، وهو شرط للتكليف والمسؤولية أمام الله سبحانه وتعالى. فإذا ما سلبت هذه الإرادة فإن المؤاخذة والمسؤولية ترتفع وتسقط عن هذا الإنسان أمام الله سبحانه وتعالى. وقلنا إنه لا إرادة بدون الحرية، وإذا تعطلت الإرادة فهذا تحطيم لطموحات الإنسان ولجميع تطلعاته، وهذا لا ينسجم أبدا مع الغاية التي خلق من أجلها، ولا ينسجم أبدا مع الدور الذي اختاره الله عز وجل لهذا الإنسان. فبدون الحرية ليس هناك كرامة، وبدون الحرية ليس هناك سعادة. فكيف يسعد امرؤ يساق إلى غير ما يريد ويفعل ما لا يحب وتفرض عليه الأفكار فرضا؟ واليوم نتكلم عن أمر مهم جدا، ونجيب عن سؤال حيوي جدا، ألا وهو: هل الحرية مطلقة؟ Beloved Muslims, dear brothers and sisters, last week we talked about freedom. We raised some questions, we answered some of these questions, and we came to certain conclusion, among which is that freedom is a divine gift that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given to humans. So it is born with the birth of every individual. It is not a favor that anyone grant to another. And this right is what enables humans to perform their role in life in the best manner. As a matter of fact, Islam asserts that the freedom is the basis of worship. Your free will is a prerequisite for a liability and responsibility before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If this will is taken away from you, if someone is forced against his will to commit an act, there is no responsibility and liability before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Without freedom there is no will, and without will there is destruction for all the ambition and aspiration of people. And this is not harmonious with the purpose of life and the road that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has chosen for humans. Without freedom there is no dignity and there is no happiness. How could a person be happy when he is driven to do things that he does not like, and when ideas and concepts as are forced upon him? Today, dear brothers and sisters, we'll answer, or try to do so, we'll answer the question: is there any freedom absolute? Or there are some constraints? for this freedom. Dear brothers and sisters, from Islamic perspective, freedom is not absolute. The freedom that Islam calls for is not chaotic. Rather, it is balanced and measured. As a matter of fact, absolute freedom inevitably leads to the violation of other people's rights and freedoms. And it leads to clashing with other people's wills and other people's pursuit of their own interests and aspiration of living in peace. As a matter of fact, dear brothers and sisters, absolute freedom only exists in the mind of some philosophers. It does not exist at all in planet Earth. Not even the most liberal societies claim that they have absolute freedom. Just examine the condition everywhere where people claim to have freedom. Look at the society in which we live. You don't have the right to drive as fast as you want in a residential area. And if you are stopped by a police and you were questioned, your answer, "This is the land of the free and the home of the brave," will not constitute a justification. Rather, they could tell you are free no more and put you in jail. Dear brothers and sisters, if you enter to a parking lot, you are not absolutely free to park wherever you want. There are certain parks that are reserved. There are certain parks that are for handicapped. And this is why there are some constraints that are applied in order to preserve the rights of everybody and the freedom of every one. You cannot say that I am free and I can kill anybody. This is the absolute freedom. You do whatever you want with no constraints. But this does not constitute a justification. You say, "Oh, give me liberty or give me death." The judge will tell you that now that you have said it, will give you death. So, freedom in the absolute, in the absolute sense, does not exist on planet Earth. And here is something about that. Humans are social by nature. They tend to live and interact with each other. They don't like to live in seclusion. The norm of humans is to live in communities and societies, and they are social by nature. If you are to give every person an absolute freedom, this without a doubt is going to clash with other people's freedom. And this is not justice. This is not fairness. If you are to be fair, you have to give that absolute freedom to everyone, and this is not possible. It is impossible to have absolute freedom if you live with other people. If you live somewhere in some planet alone, then you go ahead and do whatever you want. But once you live within a community, within a society, then there are some constraints that must be applied to this freedom. So, dear brothers and sisters, to preserve the freedom of every individual, it is necessary to apply some constraint. And here is the compromise. Here is the compromise that every civil society must accept. It is something that is necessary. And this is why, you see, societies, they have laws that govern, you see, regulate the society and govern and check the behavior of people. Every law represents a certain constraint. You cannot build anywhere in an Arbor or in a vicinity. There are zoning, there are some constraints that are applied in a society a free society. So, in the mind of everyone who calls for freedom, freedom is not absolute. As a matter of fact, absolute freedom is more like anarchy and chaos that driven by hawa and wants and desires and the likes and dislikes of people. And if it is for everyone to do whatever he wants without any kind of restraint, this is going to limit and clash and violate other people's rights and freedom. This is why Islam's freedom, it is given to everyone, and the fact that it is given to everyone necessitates that there are some restraints that are applied. But in Islam, the individual freedom does not contradict with the society freedom. It balances between the right of the society for freedom and the right of the individuals for freedom. And this is why the freedom that Islam's called for is a freedom that is practical and ideal, pragmatic and ideal at the same time, because it prevents people from infringing on your right for freedom. If there is absolute freedom, there is no constraint for other people's actions that could violate your right. أقول قولي هذا وأستغفر الله. الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيد المرسلين وإمام المتقين محمد بن عبد الله وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. Beloved Muslims, dear brothers and sisters, we are talking about freedom in the season of freedom. There are many people nowadays who are calling for freedom. And we are trying to understand freedom in order for us to understand those slogans that we call, we ask for, or we repeat. We have learned that there is no absolute freedom. Not in Islam and not in any other free society. No matter how liberal this society is, there are always some constraints that are applied. It is impossible to live in a society where everybody has absolute freedom. Now, this constraint that must be applied, that all people agree, all free people, all people who call for freedom agree that there cannot be an absolute freedom. Now, this constraint, this restriction is either going to be done by people or by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We know that we don't have a choice but to have constraint. But now, those people who agree that there should be some constraints on the absolute freedom, the choice is either this constraint comes from people or from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, from someone who is created being, or from the Creator himself, from someone whose knowledge is deficient and limited and finite, or someone whose knowledge is absolute and infinite, and someone who said, أَلَا يَعْلَمُ مَنْ خَلَقَ وَهُوَ اللَّطِيفُ الْخَبِيرُ, who knows what he has created subhanahu wa ta'ala. This constraint is either going to be from self-imposed or imposed by other people, or imposed by the laws of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وَمَنْ أَحْسَنُ حُكْمًا وَمَنْ أَحْسَنُ مِنَ اللَّهِ حُكْمًا لِقَوْمٍ يُوقِنُونَ, who is more beautiful in his judgment, more excellent and perfect in his judgment than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this is why, dear brothers and sisters, in Islam, ubudiyya, servitude, our obligations to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is what constitute the basis of freedom. It is the constraint of freedom. This is and in this, people experience the true sense of freedom, because there are certain forms of enslavement that are hidden, that are invisible, like this enslavement to shaitan, like enslavement to hawa, whims and desires, like enslavement to nafs. All these forms of enslavements are hidden, and in our submission to Allah alone, we are set free from all other types of enslavements, whether they are visible or not visible. And when we say that this is the basis of freedom, we are saying that it is the mercy that is the basis of freedom, because this message is all about mercy. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has summed up the mission of Islam by saying, وَمَا أَرْسَلْنَاكَ إِلَّا رَحْمَةً لِلْعَالَمِينَ. We did not send you but a mercy for all the worlds. So any constraint that exists to your absolute freedom, it is a constraint of mercy from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And remember, last week, before talking about freedom, we talked about the status of humans in the sight of Allah, and how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has honored that being, and how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has considered that being to be of high dignity in His sight. And today, after learning about that constraint, that basis of the freedom in Islam, it is important to say that this ubudiyya, fulfilling the obligations of ubudiyya, our duty to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, increases our status, increases our honor and dignity. As a matter of fact, there is nothing that is more honorable than being a slave to Allah. وَمِمَّا زَادَنِي شَرَفًا وَتِيهًا وَكِدْتُ بِأَخْمَصِي أَطَأُ التُّرَيَّ دُخُولِي تَحْتَ قَوْلِكَ يَا عِبَادِي وَأَنْ صَيَّرْتَ أَحْمَدَ لِي نَبِيًّا. So there is nothing that is more honorable than being a slave to Allah. And this is why, if you are to examine the Quran, you find that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given this description of ubudiyya, of servitude, of being abd, to Rasulullah Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam in his most honorable and noble situations. He said, سبحان الذي أسرى بعبده ليلا من المسجد الحرام إلى المسجد الأقصى. Glory be to the one who has taken his servant during the night, in a night journey from Al-Masjid Al-Haram to the Bayt Al-Maqdis. So this is a journey that represented honoring the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam and rather it is represent the peak of Anabi Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, a journey that started from Mecca to Baytul Maqdis to the seven heavens where Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam spoke to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Yet Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, Subhanalladhi asra bi'abdihi, His servant, His abd, His slave, to show how honorable it is to be a slave of Allah. تبارك الذي نزل الفرقان على عبده. Blessed be He who has revealed or sent down the Quran to His servant, to His abd. وأنه لما قام عبد الله يدعوه كادوا يكونون عليه لبدا. It's talking about another position of honor in which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala described His messenger as abd. So there is nothing that exceeds in merit and virtue and honor and dignity than being a servant to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Many people think that freedom can be attained by setting oneself free from the constraints of the deen or the ubudiyyah. But in fact, they are enslaving themselves or accepting the enslavement or the constraints that comes with the enslavement to shaitan, hawa and nafs. Because, dear brothers and sisters, we are humans and we are created in such a fashion to glorify something, to submit to something. And the choice is not to live without any type of enslavement, rather to choose the only right enslavement, and that is to be enslaved to Allah Rabbul Alameen. If one sets himself free from this type of enslavement, then he will be slave to everything that is created. Slave to created being, slave to hawa, slave to shaitan, slave to nafs, slave to anything that captivates his heart, to which he yields completely. And this is a concept that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam taught us to broaden our understanding of ubudiyyah. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, تعس عبد الدرهم, تعس عبد الدينار, تعس عبد الخميصة, تعس عبد القطيفة, تعس وانتكس وإذا شيك فلانتقش. In this hadith, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam is condemning what he is terming as the slave of the dinar, the slave of the dirham, the slave of the dollar, the slave of the beautiful outfit. Teaching us that there are many forms of enslavement, and indirectly telling us that our freedom comes from all these forms of enslavement is only by being slave to Allah Al-Wahid Al-Qahhar. Dear brothers and sisters, based on this understanding, you see, people have to live in a form of enslavement. So it is either slave of created being or slave to Allah. Slave to position, slave to power, slave to lust, slave to wealth, slave to the screen. And this is a new kind of enslavement that we are witnessing in our days nowadays. There are slaves of the screen, those who glorify the screen, whether it is big and wide, 3D, or small screen, whether it is the iPad screen or the iPhone screen or the iPad screen or the laptop screen or the TV screen. If the people are glued to these screens, if their glorification of the screen reach to the level where they abandon the obligations enjoined upon them by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, this is an enslavement to created being that is condemned in the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So in reality, dear brothers and sisters, the true sense of freedom cannot be attained except by submitting to Allah al-Wahid al-Qahhar. So those who think that by setting themselves free from the constraint of the deen they are free, they need to think again. Because by doing so, they are descending to a very low level in which they are accepting to be slaves to shaitan, accepting to be slave to their own hawa. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to grant this freedom to all those people who seek it nowadays. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to grant us the right understanding of freedom. Because freedom in Islam does not mean that we have a freedom to establish a gambling nightclub. Or it is not freedom for corruption. It's not to... Our aim is not to get up and to get rid of corruption in a government and start a government that runs corruption. It's very important to understand that. Rather, the true sense of freedom is when we abide or by the laws of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that consider every human being is equal to another, because they all belong to one human family, that is Adam and Hawa. أقول قولي هذا وأقم الصلاة.